Hello everybody and welcome back to the Dovetail box series. By now you should have the dovetails assembled and the box dry fitted, not glued, because that is what we're going to be doing in today's episode. Let's get going. Gluing. Now, this is easily the most stressful part of the entire project because all the hard work that you've done up until this point will be for naught if you don't get this stage right. And there's a few things that we want to do in order to prepare this for gluing up to make that process as easy as possible and as stress-free as possible apart from anything, and also save ourselves a lot of effort in later stages. Now, what I've prepared here are a couple of lengths of timber. These are square in section roughly, and they're pretty parallel and pretty smooth as well. They don't need to be absolutely perfect because we're going to be changing these, or we're going to be turning these into glue blocks, which will push on the precise areas of these joints that we want to mash together when assembling this. And I'll explain the importance of that later on. When making these, it's important that you make them with the grain going along the length of the timber, as opposed to making them go up across the short side of the timber, because short grain, it makes it really easy to break them in half, which if you can do that by hand, it's going to be far easier for your clamps that put a couple hundred kilos of force on the pieces to break that as well. Now, I will be cutting down these pieces to match the height of the box later on, but I just wanted to talk about the size of these, which is I've made them like slightly wider than the actual tails. There's just a little bit of overlap on the shoulder line here, not by much, and as I said, they're square in section, so they're pretty similar both directions. So they're pretty similar no matter which way you turn it around. And if you're able to make these out of material that is slightly softer than the box that you're working on, it means that when we turn these into gluing blocks, they're not going to bruise the timber once we apply force with the clamps, which makes it quite good for sourcing little pieces like this, because most DIY suppliers will supply softwood sections in this kind of size, so maybe just pop along to there. There'll be some sort of cheap, readily available material that will be easy to find for this stage of the project. So we're going to need 8 of these gluing blocks, which are going to be the same height as the dovetail box. I'll just cut these out and then I'll explain what we need to do to them. Okay, so I've made a bunch of these blocks, and as I said, just make sure that the grain is running along the length of these as opposed to the width of them like this. And the other thing I just want to say here is that I've seen a few people make these out of MDF before and other weird materials. I'd advise against making these out of MDF because under pressure, MDF will just turn to mush if you make these into gluing blocks. A solid wood that is either the same or slightly softer than the box you're working on is ideal. Now, we've made at least 8 of these blocks with a few spares, and what we're aiming to do with these is make one set of 4 blocks push only on the tails on each of the corners, and then we'll make the remaining 4 blocks push on the pins on the opposite components. And this is because currently the end grain of the pins is sitting proud of the 2 tails because of that marking gauge line that we established back in part 2 of this dovetail box build. Furthermore, the end grain of the tails here is sitting proud of the face that you're currently looking at. This means that if you were going to put a clamp on this box, this clamp is doing nothing more than push on the end grain of the pin component here. It's not actually touching the tails and pushing them into the bottom of the sockets. And so that is what these blocks are going to be used for. We're going to make a positive template of the tails on here and a positive template of the pins on this side, and then pop those on there so they are only pushing on the tails and only pushing on the pins. Now, it's worth saying you can avoid this by altering the marking gauge setting and setting it so that the tails are sitting proud of the pins, and that way you won't actually need to make these blocks because the clamp is just going to push directly on the tails anyway. But by doing that, it means that you've got to flush down this entire face in order to make the joint flush, which isn't the end of the world, but usually it's easier to make the end grain sit proud and then flush that off later. And there's a few benefits for gap filling, which you'll see later on, by making that end grain proud as well. The only downside to that is that you need to make these blocks in order to push on the correct area when gluing. So because these blocks are going to be individually fitted to each of the tails, I just like to number them to match with the joint that it's going to be laid on. Once I've got that number, that is going to be the number that's shown on the outside face when the block is on there, so it's going to be placed here. Now, on the bottom of these, some people will actually make the dovetail shape like this, and then cut out these remaining areas, which means you've got 2 dovetails sort of sitting proud and then they'll sit on the tails below. I don't tend to bother with that. I usually just make these square. It just makes it slightly easier to remove the material because you can do it on like a bandsaw or something like that instead of chopping these all out by hand. So let me just get a fresh one and I'll show you what I mean by that. So we'll lay it on there like that. We'll get a nice smooth side on the bottom, and then we'll get number 4 written on top. And then in order to mark out the squares, what I do is get it flush with the bottom of the box, and then I'll just put a little mark there and there at the thinnest part of the tail, but overhanging the tail as opposed to overhanging the pins. Little mark there and a little mark there. Now I'll flip them over like this and square those marks down like that. And this area is being removed, this area is being removed, and that is being removed as well. So now if I place this face down again, you can see that it's left me with 2 square sections that are going to push directly on the tails, with 4 facing upwards, so I can see that it's matching on the tails there. And I'll do exactly the same for the pins. So pop one on there, get it flush with the bottom of the box, write number 4 on it, and then we'll line this up. So now we want it to push here, here, and here, which means we want a little bit there, 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 and there. You can see I've done it so it's slightly overhanging the end grain and only going to be pushing on these 3 areas. So I'll just flip it upright, square those lines down, and then in this case we're going to be removing that and that, just leaving 1, 2, 3 to push on 1, 2, 3. Now obviously this does leave you with 2 glue blocks numbered 4, however on the back sides of them they are different, so it should be easy to distinguish between them and make sure that you get the right one pushing on the right joint. And as for cutting these out, they don't have to be particularly clean, particularly square, or particularly deep. All they've got to do is slightly sit proud in order to push on the tails. So for this one, I'll get my crosscut saw and just cut down like 1 millimeter or so, not deep at all. I'll just go along all of these lines, and then very carefully pop out the areas that I don't need. So I'll just work to halfway on this to prevent breaking out too much of the material on the opposite side. And there you go, that is all you need. And now you can see we've got a couple of blocks that are only going to push on the tails, and then when I get round to it, we'll have a corresponding block that pushes on this face as well. Now, the depth of these that I've chiseled down to, that only needs to be as deep as the amount that this sits proud by. Now, that is like the thickness of a hair. So in reality, these little blocks only need to sit proud by the thickness of a hair in order to push down on the tails, but I usually go for like 1 millimeter just for extra security. Don't go too far with this though. If you chop this all the way up to there, then 1, you've left a very weak bit of material here, but also this all turns into short grain, which would be really easy to snap off as I demonstrated earlier. So I'm just going to blast through making a load of these. It is a little bit tiresome and a little bit boring, but it is, I promise you, it's worth doing. There's no point putting all the effort into the box up until this point and then not gluing it properly. And there you go, that is 8 blocks made, and to be honest, it took about 10-15 minutes. It's really quick, especially if you square those lines across as opposed to going for like dovetail shapes to match what's going on here. So that's a really quick job, and it'll give you much better results when gluing this. Now, before doing a dry fit of this box to make sure it all closes up nicely, I am going to sand the inside faces before assembly, because getting into these corners with sandpaper after this is glued together is a pain, and you never quite get a good enough finish on those internal corners, which when someone looks at this, your eye is instantly drawn to the corners. You never look at a flat face, you look at the joints. So people are going to be drawn to that area of horrible finish and scratched up lines and maybe planer marks. We want to make sure that those corners are looking good, and pre-sanding this before assembly is a very good way of doing that. So with poplar, as discussed in previous episodes, it's quite a close grain timber, which means that I need to go to a relatively high grit, something like 240, in order to get a nice finish on this. However, if you're working with a open grain timber such as oak and ash, you probably only need to go to about 180 grit here. And make sure to use a sanding block for this to ensure it stays perfectly flat. Obviously I've got a nice flashy one, but you could go for a cork block or just an offcut of wood will be perfectly fine. Wrap the sandpaper around that and sand these nice and smooth. Thing to avoid here, make sure you don't hit the tails or the pins, because that's going to alter the joint and it may potentially open up gaps. Okay, so I've assembled the box again and the internal corners are looking lovely. I think the only thing I demonstrated there was why it's so useful to own a sanding mat slash a non-slip surface, because sanding these shorter components was it's a bit fiddly, to be honest. So pre-sanding and pre-finishing internal faces is not a new concept in furniture making. It's quite commonly done. In fact, in future projects where we start getting into drawer making, you'll see me do a lot of it there. Now, one thing that isn't talked about much, or I've never actually seen talked about, is pre-arrasing corners before assembly, because as we all know, after you make a project, you tend to round off the corners to make it nicer to hold, slightly more tactile, and there's no corners that are going to dig into the user's hands. And with this box, with this specific design, there are 4 corners which are going to be difficult to get access to after assembly. And that is this front corner, this internal corner, this one, and this one. The reason for that is because the sides sit slightly higher. Now, you can look at this and think, well, hang on, you can just sand it like that. Yes, you can, but what you'll achieve with that is you'll get a nice smooth edge here, but then it will taper up to a sharp point in the corners. Yes, you could get a sandpaper in like that and then sand it across the grain, but that's going to get you weird scratch marks going across like that. Same for these outside ones. If you try and go across like this, you're eventually going to hit that wall and you're not going to be able to take off the edge consistently going into that corner. The result will be a nice rounded surface tapering up to a weird point in the corners, and you lose the overall crispness of the piece. Now, this does take a little bit of visualization, especially when it comes to more complicated projects. A box like this is quite easy to spot those 4 internal corners that you're going to get difficulty accessing, but in reality, this is only something that I've started doing in the past year. It was never really something that crossed my mind when actually making the piece, but when it was glued together and I saw that it was difficult to get access to those corners, I realized that actually I should probably be arrasing these corners before assembling them. So looking at this box, I'm going to assess how much I actually want to round those corners before assembling it. Now, with this, we're going to have a lid that's laying on top. Granted, it's not going to be as thick as this MDF, but that lid is going to be resting on this surface. So what I don't really want to do is round this outside corner too much that it creates a weird shadow gap between those 2 components. I want that to be pretty small yet not feel too sharp when the user is holding the box. So probably 1 or 2 skims with a block plane will be perfectly fine for that. As for the internal corner, when the lid's on there, that internal corner is not going to be seen at all. And when users reach into the box, that is probably going to be the corner that is most likely to catch their hand. So I'm going to put a slightly larger round over on that internal corner, but when I say larger, it's barely anything. I'm not going for a huge rounded surface, or else it just makes the entire box look like a cloud. Probably about 5 to 6 passes with a block plane perhaps, and just make that a slightly larger chamfer but still retain the nice square and crisp look of the box. So I'm going to get these long pieces in the vise. You can see I've got the face side here, so that means this is the top edge, this is the outside edge, this is the internal edge. Get that clamped nice and low. Now, for the same reason that I can't get access to these 2 corners after assembly, I also can't get access to this top edge, because that is also going to be restricted by the 2 uprights coming up at either end. So I'll take a couple of skims of this top edge, because at the moment there's a few planer marks on there which are going to be difficult to sand out. Okay, so now what do we say? 5 strokes on the inside. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that should be fine. And then on the outside, probably just 1, 2, it needs 1 more, 3. Brilliant. And then with that internal one, I'm just going to go over it with a 240 grit block a couple of times, just to make sure that those 2 facets are also removed as well. And that feels lovely now. So a quick buzz over at the top as well. So same again on the second, couple of skims over the top. Planer marks removed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3 on there. Then we'll get the 240 grit sandpaper. Feels great. And then just a few very light passes on that internal corner. And just a quick touch on the outside as well. Beautiful. And that is it for pre-sanding. We don't need to do any more because we can still get access to the top corners after assembly. Obviously we can smooth off the outside corners after assembly. The bottom of the box doesn't really matter because we're going to be having a flat base attached to this, so that corner is not going to be interacted with by a user at all, and even if we were to put a round over on that, it's going to create a pointless shadow gap between the base of the box and the box itself. So the bottom of the box stays completely flat. It's just the top edge of the long components, the internal corner and the outside corner as well. Okay, so it's now time for the dry glue up, and we need to temporarily attach these gluing blocks so that they will stay in place while the glue is drying and while we get the clamps in place, but after it's dried, we can just break them off without causing any damage to the box. Now I've got a product here called Mitre Bond, which is nothing more than a super glue with an activator. Put the super glue on one component, put the activator on the other, stick them together, and there's an instant bond. But Mitre Bond is quite brittle, which means it breaks off pretty easily. So what I used to do with this was put a very small dab of Mitre Bond on each of the blocks, activator on the tails, and then put it on like that. And then once the glue had dried, you can normally just hit these off with a hammer and it breaks off without any damage to the dovetails, especially if you make these blocks out of a softer material than the material you're using for the box. But every now and then, this block, you get a bit too much glue on it, you'd pop it off and it would tear out a little bit of grain. And obviously we don't want that to happen because by that point, the box is dried, everything's stuck together, you can't remake that component, you've got to start from scratch or try and get that tear out of it. So a technique which is quite common in the world of wood turning and luthiery is using a paper join for something like this, where you put a sheet of paper onto the material first, then stick the block over that, and then when you break this off, the paper tears away and only leaves a little bit of residue that you've got to clean off afterwards. So we're going to do a very similar thing here as a paper joint, but instead of paper and trying to cut it to this size, simply a bit of masking tape stuck over like that. So now we're not having to glue down paper, it's just sticking itself. And a little bit of Mitre Bond, and we're talking just a tiny dab on there and on there. Bit of activator on the corresponding block. So we've got block 4 going on to block 4. Making sure that I'm using the tail block and not 4, which is meant to go on the pins. So 4 going on there. Make sure that's nice and central. And just make sure that it's not overhanging that outside edge either, or else that's going to affect things when you stick the other block on. So just back of that edge, half a millimetre or so. And there you go, that is now attached to it, which is going to be really useful when it comes to actually putting the clamps on this. But after we're done, breaks off, masking tape off, and there we go, lovely clean surface. Okay, so we've got it dry fitted in the clamps, and what we're checking for at this stage with the dry fit is that the box actually goes together square. Now, the first tendency that people want to do when they hear that is they get a square, they put it in, and then check if it's square. Now I can see that this corner is not square. It's kind of deflecting away a bit. This corner, not square, and not square. However, no matter how many adjustments they make with the clamps, which I'll be showing you how to do in a minute, no matter how many adjustments they do, they will never be able to get it square. And the reason for this is because as soon as force is applied to a square carcass, the sides will bend under the force of the clamps, which means that they could bend internally like this, they could bend externally, or it could be a mixture of the two. Try and measure that for square using an engineer's square. There is no point in which you could do that, and also you don't actually know if this one is bending in or bending out whatsoever. The diagram that I've drawn here is very exaggerated. You will not see it like this. It's an extremely subtle thing, but trying to make this square under the pressure of clamps is near enough impossible, which means that the only real way of checking if this is going to go together square after the glue is dried is to measure the diagonals and make sure that they are exactly the same, so that when the clamps are disengaged, everything springs back and it should be nice and square. Problem with this being, how do you get a ruler in there to accurately measure that? You can try and get under these clamps, but there's just no way of doing it. So what I want to introduce to you here is a pinching stick, or should I say pinching sticks. These are two thin components with an acute point that is less than 90 degrees on either end. And what you can do with these sticks is get the two pointy ends, push them into opposing corners. And once you've done that, draw a line that goes across both of them, nice and clear so you can easily see where it is. And then we'll put that on the opposite corners and let's see what we got. Don't know if you can see this, but that line is misaligned now. When I push this stick into the corner, that line isn't quite reaching the other one, which indicates that the corner that I just checked, this one, is slightly shorter than the one going along here. We've got a slightly skewed carcass going on here. So I've drawn another exaggerated view of what's going on here. As you can see, we've got a skewed box, and I think you'll agree that corner to corner here is longer than this corner to corner. So to sort this out, what we want to do is kind of squish these two corners together, and the obvious way to do that would be to put a clamp here and here and mush it together like that. But that's going to give us way too much of an adjustment. You can probably see that it's most likely going to push it the other way, and apart from anything, perhaps damage that outside corner. So we want to recreate that action, but pushing on the faces as opposed to pushing directly on the corners. So what we'll do with this clamp is, instead of pushing it on the corner, we'll push it there, and ideally we would push it down here as well. But you can see that's going to be way too much of an angle on the clamp, and it's just going to slip along that face. So we have to bring the bottom one across even more, so that instead of pushing parallel with this face, it's actually pushing a little bit off, away from that edge in the direction of the long corner. So if I just recreate it with this, we want to avoid going corner to corner. What we've currently got going on with that carcass is we're going parallel with this edge. So we need to meet halfway between the two, and all you do is simply skew it slightly towards that long corner. So sometimes you can get away with just doing this with one clamp, which will probably be the case with this, seeing as it's a lightweight carcass and it was only off by 1mm. On larger carcasses, you may need to do it with two clamps and angle it slightly away from the second face as well, and therefore get more of a push on the longer corners. And for particularly out of square carcasses, you can also do it on these short edges as well. If you put the clamp there and there, we can then go away from those sides, and instead of pushing it corner to corner like this, we're instead just angling it towards that long corner but still pushing on the two faces. So let's put that into practice. We've established that this is the short corner, therefore this is the long corner to corner joint. So we can't push it corner to corner like this, but the least we can do is angle these clamps so that they push in the direction of that long edge. I reckon if I just do this one up a bit more, let's test it again. Draw a line across the two, and then on the opposite corner, there you go. So now you can see that before it was stopping here, it's actually moving beyond that line now. We've now pushed it off the opposite direction simply by angling this bottom clamp towards that long diagonal. So you can see on a lightweight carcass how sensitive this can be. In fact, on this one I actually over tightened it a little bit just to make that even more prominent. But that's basically what the dry fit and the actual glue up comes down to. It's doing fine adjustments with these clamps, tweaking them towards those long diagonals in order to make the diagonals the exact same length. So let's reassess it. I'll just scribble out those lines. Now we know that this is now the longer diagonal, so I'm going to reduce the angle of this clamp down here so that it goes slightly more parallel with the outside edge and make less of an adjustment on it. That hopefully will have eased it slightly so that it's moved back into being square. There we go. So it's exactly the same length, simply by moving that so it's less of an angle towards the longer diagonal. And that is what the dry fit is all about. It's about being prepared for what difficulties may arise once you've got glue on this, because I could have slapped glue on that, put it together, tried to check it for square, and then realized, oh, actually, I need to make some pinching sticks because this isn't square. And while the glue's drying, I'm off making the pinching sticks, and then before I know it, that's dried, can't make any adjustments. Even in a simple project like this, doing a dry fit before the actual glue up will pay off, let alone when we move on to the more complicated stuff later. So I've now taken the pieces out of the clamps, and what we're going to do is mask off the inside faces to prevent any glue squeeze out from getting inside and yellowing it, because that is going to be difficult to sand out the inside corners, and we've put in all this effort to get it nice and smooth. We don't want some yellowish glue to ruin all of that. So what I've got here is some low tack masking tape. Painter's tape is perfectly fine. I use this stuff from Tesa, which is really nice. Doesn't leave any residue left over on the work afterwards and is extremely easy to get off, and has a nice sort of waxy coating on it, so it prevents gluing the masking tape down by soaking into it. So I'll pop a link to this in the description. It's really useful stuff to just have around the workshop. So we'll just make sure to tape all of these joints off, getting right up to the insides of those sockets and tails. So that's all the gluing prep to do. We've made blocks, we've sanded the inside faces, we've masked everything off to make sure that we don't get any glue squeeze out, and most importantly, we've done a dry fit to make sure there's going to be no surprises once we start putting the glue on it. So I normally just put a big dollop of glue on a leftover bit of sandpaper or something like that. Just find it a little bit easier to work with, and then I've just got an offcut of veneer here, but like paper or something will work just fine. And when I do this, a little bit up the sides of each of the sockets, not too much. You don't want so much in here that you end up gluing that block on with proper wood glue, because it becomes much more difficult to get off. Some people debate whether you should put glue on end grain or not, and debate its effectiveness or not. You don't get much strength from putting glue on end grain because wood is like a series of tubes, and when I put glue on this, it's just going to soak down into it. But I put it there just because you get a little bit of squeeze out that helps fill any potential gaps that are at the bottom of the shoulder line. So I don't see any harm in it. And then finally, a little bit on the back of the sockets as well, which will contact the end grain within each of the tails. But I'm going to leave this top edge dry of any glue, because some of this is going to be poking proud of the tail once it's assembled. And once you've put the first clamps on and you've tightened them up, just ease them off a little bit so that when you put the second ones on, they're able to push these components into the bottom of their sockets without these holding them in place. After you've got these ones pushed down, you can then re-tighten the original ones that you put on. Okay, so let's check again that they're going square. You never know, it might be okay this time around. Okay, so it's looking like pretty close actually. It's looking like that might just be a little bit short going on this angle. So this one is the long diagonal. We're going to just ever so slightly, let's go for this one, and just move it round so that it's pushing towards that longer diagonal. Draw another line. Cool, right, I think I'm happy with that. And there we go. After all that faffing, the box is gluing. Trust me, all the effort is worth it. When you take the clamps off and you see how glorious this thing looks, once you plane all those faces flat and sand it smooth and everything, it is worth all those extra steps that we've taken now with regards to finishing the inside before assembly, masking off the internal faces, making blocks, making sure it's square. They're all things that will save you so much work in the future. So that's it for this episode. You are now ready to move on to the next one, which you can do so by clicking the link below. And if you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button to the left-hand side of the video. See you in the next one.